Dubious ones, welcome back to the channel. And if you're new to the channel, this is something new for me because this is something very near and dear to my heart. I've been following and watching the new X-Men 97 series since it debuted, as I'm sure all of you watching have as well. And I have to say, mind blown. Everything the MCU has done since Endgame has been questionable. Loki was fantastic. She-Hulk, a lot of the other MCU shows and movies were iffy at best, but I'm not going to complain because you know what? I've loved the MCU as a whole since it began, but my biggest fandom came from two things out of the MCU as a child. Now, I wasn't a huge comic book kid. I did read comics. I did have a good handful of them, good couple hundred comics, but I was not a crazy comic book kid. For me, growing up, there's two things. I grew up in the 90s. I grew up with Spider-Man and X-Men. X-Men 92, 97, ended in 97. X-Men 97. That original show on Fox was, to me, the best. That and the Spider-Man from that same era, from that exact same time, those two shows, to me, formed my childhood fandom of superheroes and specifically the Marvel franchise. I personally really enjoyed the Spider-Man movies and the X-Men movies when they came out. Obviously, looking back through a glass ball, they weren't all perfect. I enjoyed them just the same, just as much as I enjoyed many of the MCU movies all throughout its inception. I didn't love them all. Iron Man I thought was great. I love the franchise. Captain America I wasn't so crazy about. But again, it's based on my fandom as a child. So for me, X-Men and Spider-Man were top of the tier. And then you had guys like Iron Man as a side character, Captain America, more of a side character, Silver Surfer as a side character, Fantastic Four. For me, it was like, did you show up in the Spider-Man cartoon in the 90s? Or did you show up in the X-Men cartoon in the 90s? Then I was a big fan. That's how I grew up. I didn't grow up reading a million comic books. I read comic books because of the cartoons. Because of the cartoons I watched in the 90s, then I bought comic books based on them. So I started reading Spider-Man comics. I started reading X-Men comics. But my entire fandom was grown from the Fox Kids Saturday morning lineup. So I'm sure as many of you are the same. If you're watching X-Men 97, you probably watched the entire franchise from 92 to 97 of the X-Men. And this most recent episode was beautiful as we got Professor Charles Xavier. Now, I'm not going to get to last episode because last episode made me tear up and is what made me think to do this as a series and even cover it on the channel. We're going to get to that either tomorrow or the day after. I'm going to try and get my daughter to watch with me. She's a few episodes behind. I've been trying to force her to watch the X-Men 97 with me, get into it a little bit. So I'm going to try and get her opinion on what happened with Gambit, what happened in the last episode, as well as she's an episode behind that. She hasn't seen the Jubilee episode yet either, and Jubilee actually is her favorite character at the moment. So I'm going to get her opinion on those episodes preceding this. We're not going to touch on the older episodes too much. Today is going to focus on brand new episode, Season 1, Episode 6, where we are covering Charles Xavier joining the Shi'ar Empire with Lilandra. Absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. Now, I don't know how much of this I'm able to show, so we're going to mute things, because I definitely don't think I'm allowed to have any audio. But this is where we had Charles sitting up top on the throne. He is getting ready to marry Lalandra's sister. Now, if you didn't follow Ken back in the day in the whole Phoenix saga in the 92 through 97 old X-Men, or followed in the comics, Ken was her evil brother. He was the ruler of the Shi'ar Empire and wanted to control the M'Kraan crystal. X-Men helped out the Shi'ar Empire. These two fell in love. We remember at the very end of X-Men 90, or the original X-Men cartoon, she took Charles away because he was sick and was dying, and they could only help him in space with their futuristic technology. So this entire season we've been told Charles Xavier is dead. We knew he was not dead. We knew he was with Lalandra over here, and now these two are to be wed. But unfortunately, the evil sister of Lalandra here, not a fan of this happening. And we got some really incredible stuff again. I apologize. I really don't know how much I'm able to show, more than 10 or a few seconds at a time on YouTube for fair use. So I've got to be really careful here. But this episode was incredible. We had two storylines playing out through this episode. We had Storm, who's recently lost her powers. If you've been following the series, spoiler alert, already too late, but Storm has lost her powers. She's with Forge. We know Forge, again, if you're not following the comics, but you watched the original X-Men cartoon like I did, we know Forge as one of the guys from the future who makes all the cool gadgets and designs, which allows Bishop to travel through time. Forge is that cool guy who does all the technology stuff that we love. Apparently, he's also the guy who came up with the collars to take away mutants' powers, which you would think, again, spoiler alert, forget the last episode with Gambit, everything that happened there, but you would think Gambit and Rogue would maybe have a thing where maybe they just have a collar for Rogue, so that when Gambit and Rogue want to, maybe if they are into each other, because Gambit's always been really into Rogue. How much into Gambit has Rogue been? That's been a question I've heard online. I always thought was crazy. It always seemed like they were madly in love with each other. Gambit being one of my favorite X-Men of all time, favorite mutants of all time, favorite Marvel characters of all time. But, I mean, they have those collars. They have the use of them. They could just, couldn't they just put one of those as if it were a condom on Rogue and just let her be able to touch Gambit then with her skin-to-skin contact while wearing one of those collars? Would that not work? Would that not be a solution to their whole situation and you wouldn't have to have Magneto get involved in the whole... Anyways, we don't want to get into the other episodes, as this is just trying to focus on episode 6. But those are my thoughts on those. But for episode 6, oh my goodness, Charles Xavier, he's walking. They have those fake prosthetic legs for him. They're getting him to walk. Then they're trying to walk all over him. And then they say for him to be able to marry into the Shi'ar Empire, because they consider Earth a lesser planet. And as far as terrestrials and everything, they're like, no, we're not joining this in the Milky Way galaxy. If you want to get in to the Shi'ar Empire, then you must renounce the X-Men. You must renounce everything you've ever known, and just forget that Earth ever existed and only know this future. And we got so close where, Charles said, you've given up so much to help me. I'm willing to give this up for you. But when it came down to the brass tacks, they wanted Charles to renounce the X-Men, and Charles said, I don't think so. So we're going to fast forward here. So what did Charles do? He finally used his mutant powers, finally used his telekinetic and telepathic abilities to get all of them into the astral plane to teach them all a lesson. Give them a little schooling. And let them all know that, hey, you know what? I'm a very powerful mutant, which he's the most powerful, arguably the most powerful mutant alive, or one of the most powerful telepaths in the world, and really was starting to put the Shi'ar in their place, especially Lalandra's sister, who was trying to argue again against the trickery of Charles Xavier, and he put an apple in her mouth. It's quite funny, but it's just a whole lot of awesome, because what we learned is that, hey, Charles was willing to give up everything. His memories of Earth, his memories of the X-Men, and everything. But then when it came down to brass tacks, his students were more important. And what we get at the end of this episode, before we get to that, spoiler alert, we don't want to get there yet, we also had the side story. So before I break the end and break into the talks of the very end of this episode, before that, we had Storm with Forge. Storm powerless. Forge has been bit by the evil demon bird mutant that has been terrorizing them the whole time Storm has been over at, Forge's compound. Forge and her had an on-again, off-again relationship where he was hiding some things from her. She found out. She fell out of love, like they were in love, but she fell out and was upset that he was hiding these things from her. And then because he was sick and because he tried to save her life from the evil demon, he got bit. She's now trying to save him and trying to help him because he's a good man, and trying to ignore the powers of the demon, and as the demon is trying to suck her in and say no and just give in and I'll give you your powers back and just give in to me and blah blah blah, and she's like, no, I'm more powerful than you. So this side story again did not interest me nearly as much, obviously, as you can tell by my reactions, as much as the Charles and Lalandra story and the Shi'ar story. But I did enjoy this multi-episode story where we finally get to see how Storm finally gets her powers back. So hopefully this doesn't demonetize us, but we're going to see Storm here as she's arguing with the Beast. She's going in, and you can see her. It's just like, yes, it's that yes moment in the MCU. We're getting it, where she's getting her powers back, and she's like, no, I'm forcing you away. I'm not going to take your S word. And whabam, our goddess, Aurora, is back in full force, shooting out lightning out of her hands. Storm is back, baby. So absolutely amazing. I hope that wasn't too long for fair use for that scene, but Storm has her powers back. She was able to help save Forge. She had to conquer her own fears, if you didn't see earlier in when she was going through the cave and going into the dark spots and conquering her fear of small spaces, darkness, everything else. We got that whole big deal. That was cool. But again, this storyline to me, super, super B storyline when in comparison to the emotions I felt about Charles Xavier having to teach all the lessons and everything, and then we get the big moment. As Charles is teaching these lessons, let's take a look. He's teaching why and how and why we need to move on, and the mutants, and why blah 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 their people will understand, because they're saying our people won't understand and they won't get this and everything. I'm pretty sure if Charles could get into all of their heads, I'm telling you right now, I feel like if he can get into all the Sharis and all the, like, the entire, their whole planet and galaxy and people's heads, pretty sure that, he'd be able to convince them on his own. If he's able to bring all the head-ups and bring them all to the astral plane and explain to them why, why there's an issue and everything else, I feel like he could probably convince the rest of the Empire to be okay with him marrying Lalandra. But regardless, This happens because of what we got in the last episode. Did Gambit just die? Did we lose Gambit in the last episode? Because now we get the visual of Charles seeing in the astral plane. He's seeing Gambit. He's seeing my X-Men know what's going on. He sees the vision of the Sentinels. And then we get the full-on Charles. No, I can't leave my X-Men. Oh, but we were so close. We almost convinced them all. We need you to keep going. And he's like, no, regardless, I'm not giving up my X-Men. My X-Men are number one. I have to go see my X-Men. They need me. It's BS that I've been gone for so long. And Charles makes the realization. He's like, he's got to go back, whether he's got to give up the love of his life, which I'm so sad for. I mean, I always felt bad for him that, like, everything that happened with Myra, and that he never got her back in the 90s cartoon. Because again, not a comic book reader, not following all the love stories of Charles Xavier, just from the 90s cartoon, the issues to Myra and everything else, his whole love life's always been sad. So it was so nice to see him with Lilandra, being in love, for them to get married. I was excited. I was emotionally involved in this episode. I don't know if you guys were, but my God. And then when he saw what happened to Gambit, and he got the astral projections of what was going on with the Sentinels and everything else. And he said, no, that's it. There are certain things that are more important. And he's willing to sacrifice his own happiness, and he has to go back to Earth, regardless if the Shi'ar will have him after the fact or everything else. My goodness, this episode made me tear up as a grown-ass man and made me feel things. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. The last episode with Gambit, in episode 5, and we will be touching on it. I'm going to get my daughter to watch it first because I want her opinion. Someone who never watched the 90s cartoon. Because again, I didn't really read a whole lot of X-Men comics and know a whole lot. The only backstory I have is from the 90s cartoon. So my daughter having even less than that, and only watching bits, just the few episodes that we have this season. I want to know her thoughts on it, because for me, that last episode made me tear up like a baby. Like, when that happened again, Gambit being one of my personal favorite X-Men of all time. I love his powers. I've always been in love with that power fantasy, and like with the throwing of the cards and everything. I grew up enjoying casinos and playing cards as an adult. To me, Gambit was always one of my top 3-4 favorite mutant powers. I loved him. I loved Iceman. Of Magneto. As far as outside of the X-Men, I love Spider-Man, I love Venom, I love Carnage. Those were, and Silver Surfer. Those are all my favorite Marvel characters as a whole. Wolverine to a lesser extent as well. But out of the X-Men, because if you're excluding Magneto and Iceman, Gambit was by far my favorite. Even if you include Magneto and Iceman, I would still say Gambit's probably number 1 or maybe number 2. I absolutely loved him. I thought they did him dirty this season in the early episodes. Super dirty. But then that redemption arc in episode 5 blew my mind. It's what made me have to start covering this show on my channel, because, my God, this is the greatest storytelling the MCU, in my opinion, has done since Endgame. I loved Loki. I loved Loki season 1. Loved Loki season 2. That and Endgame, fantastic. Everything they've done since Endgame outside of Loki, not about it. If we are including the newest Spider-Man, Spider-Man 3 of the new generation Spider-Man, like the third iteration of Spider-Man, or their MCU Spider-Man, okay, that as well. Fantastic. I love that movie. Love the nostalgia. Love seeing Tobey Maguire. Love seeing Andrew Garfield. I loved the nostalgia. It hit me on all the feels. That movie was probably one of my favorite movies of all time. So, I mean, but again, Spider-Man being one of my favorite superheroes, can't really do no wrong putting him in a movie for me. But I would say outside of that and Loki, everything else has been mediocre at best. I didn't hate the new Thor movie. I didn't hate She-Hulk, but everything the MCU has done for me didn't drive me crazy. But again, my fandom came from X-Men and Spider-Man. Iron Man was tertiary extra character. Captain America, I didn't love the movies, and I definitely didn't ever love the character growing up. I think that plays a big deal into it. That's why I never really cared for the Hulk or She-Hulk. I didn't read their comics. I read Silver Surfer a little bit, didn't read the Fantastic Four, so I didn't really care for the Fantastic Four, but I love when they introduced Silver Surfer because I knew who that was. So I think it's really about how you grew up, what cartoons, what comic books you read. For me, X-Men and Spider-Man were the two biggest influences on my comic book fandom and my MCU fandom as a kid. And I think X-Men 97 by far is the greatest thing the MCU has produced since Endgame. I loved Loki. Never really knew the character as a kid. So, amazing job there as well. Loki and X-Men 97. They're on two different levels. One's a real, real characters. The other one's a cartoon, continuing from my fandom as a child from X-Men 97, or like from 92 to 97. We're continuing that series with the same stories, but they don't have the same restrictions they had as kids. They're able to make it more adult, give you more better themes, give you like just a better overall product. So X-Men 97 right now on the hype train, right up here. But low-key for me as well, again, top of the top. Those are my two by far favorite MCU products at the moment. I mean, movies I'm looking forward to, I couldn't even tell you until the next Spider-Man comes out or until X-Men comes out. Couldn't care less really about the Fantastic Four movie. I'll watch it. I'm sure it'll be great. But again, MCU, you need to capitalize on the fandom of everybody who grew up and what were the two biggest comics in all of Marvel. X-Men and Spider-Man. For me, that's where my fandom lives. So I want to see more cartoons, more TV shows, more movies based around these characters because they have such an incredible lore behind them. But this episode 6 of season 1 of X-Men 97, fantastic. Episode 5 was even better. But we will cover episode 5, weirdly, after we cover episode 6, because I want to get my daughter's take on it. She's 10. She's not a huge MCU fan. She's watched some of the movies, but she's not crazy into it, doesn't read comics or anything. Try to get her to watch X-Men 97. She hasn't watched the cartoon up to now. I want to get her thoughts on it too, because it's all my love for that episode because it was super incredible? Or is it because of my fandom from before and my fandom of Gambit? So I want to get that insight from her if I can before I touch on reviewing that episode. But Dubious Ones, again, something very different for the channel, something very different for me. Hope you guys enjoyed, and if you're new to the channel, please subscribe down below as I'll be covering all things MCU, cartoons, video games, mostly on this channel. To date, we've been covering video games, but we're just going to cover everything that I'm passionate about. And if you like this video, I like you, and I will catch you in the next one. Dubious Ones, for now, I will have to catch you in the next one.